What's going on? Welcome to episode 21 of the Hike.files podcast. I'm your host, Kurt Zitzelman, and this week we're going to talk about wind. The video I released yesterday was about probably the windiest campsite I've ever had. The windiest camp overnight. It was pretty bad. So I figured that's a good opportunity for me to get on the podcast and talk about that and what you should do in that situation. So that's what I'm going to do. Ideally, if you're just going out for like one night, you're just driving out to spot the camp just to get out, always check the weather. Check the weather and see if it's going to be windy. That's one of the things I do check for. On this particular night that I was out, the wind wasn't supposed to be as bad as it was, so the weather didn't really help me. But there are some things that you can do in case you get stuck in a spot where, or say you're just out on the trail for a couple days and it gets really windy one night unexpectedly. Good practice when you're picking a camp spot is to always check the trees around you. Now, I hammock most times, so I'm always checking trees anyway because I want to make sure I'm hanging from good trees. But you should always be looking at the trees around you, whether you're in a hammock or you're in a tent or you're just going to tarp camp or cowboy camp or whatever you're going to do. If you're in a shelter, I have seen trees come down on shelters, and usually they're pretty sturdy, but you never know. You don't want to take that chance. So always check those trees. The things you want to look for, first thing, look up. Look at up in the canopy and see if any of the trees look like they're already broken. Broken branches maybe hanging up in other branches. If it's summer, make sure they all have leaves or needles if they're coniferous. Look down the tree. Look along the bark. Look and see if it's sloughing off its bark. It's not a good sign. Trees use the bark to protect themselves. If they're losing their bark, they're probably not in good shape. Check the kind of tree. This takes a little bit of practice to learn your trees, but if you know there's going to be ash trees in the area where you're camping, always look for those. Familiarize yourself with the bark and the leaves and check for them. In North America, we have the emerald ash borer, which gets into the tree and eats the pulp. You don't even know that it's happening. There's no outward appearance showing that it's happening. And they can do this so quickly that the tree will still have leaves like it's alive and actually be mostly hollow on the inside. And then all it takes is one even remotely good gust of wind, and that tree snaps in half and falls. So always look for those. That is my biggest thing to look for when I'm looking for a campsite, is I'm looking for ash trees, because you can't tell sometimes. With those emerald ash borers, you just can't tell. Generally, I will look for evergreen coniferous trees, pine trees, hemlocks, things like that, because they're really easy to tell if they're sick. If they don't have leaves on them or needles, if they don't have needles on them, you stay away from them. If it's a hemlock and it's got what looks like algae growing on tips of the branches, that's an infestation. That tree might not be the best thing to hang near or camp near. You got to take a little time and look at your camp and make sure that it looks safe. Now, like I said, you want to check the weather too and see what the winds are going to be. For me, if I see that the winds are going to be, gusting up in the 30s, 40 mile an hour, I won't go. If it's an option. If I'm already out on trail and the weather changes, you just got to make the best of it. So I'm going to talk about some of the worst winds I've camped in, and a couple of them that were, I guess, like honorable mentions, where it was windy, but maybe it wasn't as bad. One was at the campsite I was just recently at, and it was the first time I was there. And over in Pinchot State Forest, the campsites out there, they're not named. They're not maintained by the state forest or anything like that. They're just been made there by hikers over the years. There's so many of them that I just named them for my own reference. And this particular campsite, the first time I stayed in it, there was a snow squall that came through. And I knew there was snow coming through, but I didn't know it was going to be like a squall line initially. But I figured, I'll go out. I'll give it a shot. I don't mind camping in the snow. And it got pretty windy, but the wind stayed high for the most part, and I was okay. Now, that campsite has got a lot of hemlocks, a lot of pines, hemlocks, and coniferous trees, evergreens. So I knew I was pretty safe. They are very good at blocking wind and breaking wind. So I took the chance. I stayed there. I could hear the wind over me, but it was not it wasn't bad. I got hit with a couple of light gusts that night, but it was more the snow that was blowing in from the swamp outside of camp. But it was fine. I didn't have an issue with it. So there was that one, and I don't know what the wind gust got up to that night. It sounded really bad overhead, but it usually does. That's going through the tops of the trees. The next one that I would say is like an honorable mention for wind is the one that I bailed out on, and that was also in Pinchot State Forest. And that was up on top of the ridge. I don't know what the ridge is called, but it's over on by Sassafras Hill area, and maybe it's just Sassafras Hill, but that would make a lot of sense. I was camping there, and it was, I think they were oaks. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, I identified the trees as oaks and not as ash. So I was pretty confident camping there. And I had checked the weather. I'd done a very good weather check. It was supposed to be like 10 to 15 mile an hour gusts, which really isn't that bad. But the temperature dropped a lot. It actually got so cold so quickly that the humidity, it looked like it was snowing. It was just the humidity freezing in the air. It was crazy. So it got colder than it was supposed to. And those winds jumped up to 30 to 40 miles an hour. And I was having a hard time staying warm because I wasn't prepared for that. And I just had a really off feeling about that wind in the trees I was in. Maybe because I was pretty sure they were oaks, but if there was an ash in there, I didn't want to take that chance. So I used that as an opportunity to, in that video, show what to do when you need to bail out. And it stayed windy all night. It was a little bit harrowing with that wind. But again, it sounded worse than it was. And I was getting hit with a little bit of wind because there is a field right next to where I was camped. But I didn't really feel like I was that much in danger. I was just uncomfortable with the situation. So I bailed out. The next one was in Wisconsin. I was on the Ice Age Trail. And it was my first night there. So I had gotten to the trailhead at, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, I think. I didn't have a lot of daylight left. It was in April. And so it might have been later. It might have been like 5 or 6. But I got out there, parked at the trailhead I was going to park at, and hiked in. I figured I'd hike in until I saw my first campsite that I liked. And then not far, because I just wanted to get set up. It had been a long drive, and I just wanted to not be in the car. So I find a spot. I get about 1.5 miles in, I think. I find a spot, make a campsite. Everything looked good. Checked the trees, did all that. And I was up on a knoll, but on top of that knoll, there was a little bit of a depression. So I was up, but protected. And I knew there was a chance of it raining and possibly snowing. And when I woke up in the morning and I was getting ready to break down, just this storm front blew through. And so it wasn't the whole camp. It wasn't like the whole night. But that morning, I remember sitting in my hammock for probably an hour and a half, maybe, and just sitting in the hammock with my hand out, holding the tarp. And the wind was just hitting it so hard and so consistently. It was pushing the tarp and me back like a foot, just consistently. And it would stop, and I kind of rock back up. And I was trying to record and show it, and there was no way. So I didn't get out of camp till late. But that was a situation where I didn't really have a choice but to stay out for that. I was so far away from home. It wasn't like I can just bail out and go home. So I just rode that out. And I don't know what the wind was like there, like what the wind gust speeds were, but it was pretty high. I bailed out of camp. Well, I didn't bail out. I was ready to leave, but I wanted to leave a lot earlier, which I couldn't. So it screwed up my plans for what I was going to do for that trip. So I wound up bouncing around a little bit instead of doing a straight through. And I couldn't, like, my gear was all wet, and it wasn't just wet, but it was saturated because that wind was blowing rain and snow and ice up underneath everything, even with my tarp doors pulled in and everything. So I wound up used the shares of, it was the Ice Age Trail, if I didn't mention that, and it's shared use with some cross-country ski trails. And on those trails, there was a little warming hut that was completely enclosed, like an actual real door sealed in. So I went in there and pulled my gear out and let it dry a little bit, made my breakfast in there. So I lost 3 or 4 hours just because of the wind on a trip. So that kind of sucked. But it's one of those situations where you got to be safe than sorry. And since I was so far away from home, and like the closest people I knew were 2.5 or 3 hours away, they weren't going to get to me anytime soon. Yeah, if they would have even been able to find me. Yeah, it was rough with that wind, but again, picking the right campsites and looking at the trees and knowing that everything was as safe as I could safely assume, safe as I could safely assume. Yeah, that sounds right. Really helped out in that situation. Now we start getting into things that were a little more dicey. And these are probably the three worst windy camps. And the next two are tied. And the only reason why one is better than the other is because of just projectiles being thrown by the wind. So the number three would be, I did a 3-day solo trip up into the Catskills years ago. It was late February, I believe, or early March. We had a warm stretch and all the snow had melted, at least here where I live. And I figured there might be some snow up in the Catskills still. And there was, but nothing major. I never had to break out my micro spikes or anything like that. All the snow that I saw was in the shadow of like rock faces and cliffs and caves and stuff like that. There's really nothing on the trail. So I found this really cool little spot to camp. It was right on the edge of a rock bald, which maybe wasn't the greatest idea in hindsight, but that's the spot I found. And there was supposed to be a campsite nearby, but I couldn't find it. So this was an old campsite. There was an old fire pit there. I just used that. And I stayed there for 2 nights. And both nights, I was at the foot of Mount Wittenberg on the Phoenicia side. You're still up on top of what's called the Grand Staircase, but Wittenberg you're at the base of Wittenberg where it makes its prominence over that section of the mountains. All night I could hear the wind coming across Wittenberg. Now, Wittenberg is part of the Burroughs Range, and it's Wittenberg, Cornell, and Slide. And Slide is the highest peak in the Catskills. So you've got some pretty big mountains there for the area that generate a lot of wind. So you could hear the wind come over Wittenberg, which would have been like behind me in my camp, over Wittenberg, and then over the camp, like way up in the air, way above. And it sounded like a freight train going over. And then on the other side of on the other side of me, opposite from Wittenberg, it drops off at the Grand Staircase and it drops into, I believe it's Woodland Valley. I think that's what it is. Or is that around the corner from it? Either way, there's this valley there. And the wind would come across and it'd get over to the mountain range that I came in on. And then I crossed over to where I was. So it gets over there and it drops down, hits those mountains. And you could hear it go, you actually hear it go below my level into the valley. And then it would curl back up and come up over Grand Staircase, over that rock bald, which was only 30 or 40 feet. I was maybe 30 or 40 feet in the trees, and they weren't big trees. So it came across that rock bald and just into the trees I was in and just pushed me, the trees, the tarp, the hammock, everything. Would just moved everything over a couple feet and would just hold me there. And it would stop and I'd rock back and sway. And that happened all night for 2 nights. And it was worse the second night. But the first night I got a little bit of sleep. The second night was just brutal because every time I just about fall asleep, I'd hear it come over the mountain. And it wasn't consistent. Maybe twice an hour it would happen. But you just hear this, oh, here it comes. I got about 30 to 45 seconds before it drops in the valley and comes back up and hits me. And sure enough, it would hit. And that wind was consistent when it hit for sometimes 30 seconds to a minute would hold. It was bad. That was pretty bad. I don't know what the wind speeds on that were, but in order to hold all that gear at a constant rate like that and just push you over, it wasn't slow. It wasn't just like a normal wind, little breeze coming through. Number 2 would be Red River Gorge in Kentucky. The first time I went down there with Dragon and Panda, we met up with Jason Mois, backpacking with Jason, and he showed us around on the first day, and on the second day, he went back to work. So he gave us some ideas where to go. We were going to camp out at I don't remember where we were heading out to. I just know that the road was closed. There was like a culvert that collapsed as we were driving in, and some cars were coming out going, you don't want to go down there. So we drove out. We were just trying to find a spot. We wanted to be somewhere that was close to, we want to backpack in fairly close to the parking lot, maybe a mile, set up camp. So that way we get up early in the morning, get back out the car and drive home. Every parking lot we went by, because it was like the last busy weekend, like on season weekend. So every parking lot was just packed. And down there you have to have a permit if you're staying in Red River Gorge. So you got to have a permit on your car. So we'd look at the parking lot and we look at the windows. We see permit. Like, all right, most of those people aren't day hiking; they're staying there. So we kept going, trailhead to trailhead. And as we came around the corner, like the last corner that we came around, we look off to our left, and right along the Red River, there's a campsite, like a campground, like a campground. And it's pretty good size. And there's 1 or 2 people in there. So we all just look at each other. Do we want to just pay for a campsite? Like, how much more do we have to drive around to find somewhere to camp? Are we going to find somewhere to camp? So we just made the decision. We'll just rent a campsite. They got trees down there. We'll be fine. So we go in, we rent the site, and we knew weather was moving in, but we didn't expect this kind of wind. And it was pretty open. You got to figure it's a campground, so it's not like you're in the forest. So it was very large, very tall, deciduous trees. So branches are all up high, hardwoods. And we're set up, and I was in a hammock, Dragon was in a hammock, and Panda had her tent, and the wind picked up. And then it kept picking up, and it kept picking up, and it kept picking up. And the soil there is very sandy. So my tent stakes for my tarp kept on getting pulled out. So I get out and I reset the stake and I get back in. 10 minutes later, it would pull out. I reset it, and a couple minutes later, it'd pull out. And I was like, oh my God. So I get out and I'm looking at the sky. I'm looking at the clouds, because the last radar I saw, once the clouds, this front had blown through, it was going to clear up and the wind was supposed to drop. So I'm just looking to see if the clouds were breaking up at all. Just trying to get some kind of idea of how long this is going to last. Tarp stake pulls out again. I'm like, oh my God. So I just get back in the hammock. I'm just laying in my hammock with the corner of the tarp in my hand because it won't stay in the ground. And the wind's picking up more and more. And I hear a branch come out of a tree and hit the car. Not a big one, but I'm like, oh, here we go. Like, that's not good. And I pull the tarp back so I could poke my head out and try to look up through the trees, because I believe this was April, so there wasn't a lot of leaves on the trees. So I pulled the tarp back so I can look, and I'm looking up, just looking at the trees and trying to look through to see the clouds. And I see a branch break off right over my head and fall towards me. And it was just instinct. I just take my tarp and I just pulled it out over me to just deflect it a little bit. And luckily it did. It didn't go through the tarp, and I'm surprised. And it's probably because it wasn't taut, and it was just, I was holding it, so it gave a little bit when the branch hit. But that was enough for me. I'm like, all right, I'm out of the hammock. I get out of the hammock. Panda gets out of her tent. Dragon's, he's out. He doesn't care what's going on. He's just asleep. Now we're both out and standing there looking to see if there's anything else that looks like it could break off in the trees. And we turn and look towards where Dragon's hammock is set up. And we got our headlights on, and we see a branch come out, and it just like spears right down. And from where we were standing, it looked like it could have hit him. And we're just like, oh my God. And it hits the ground next to him. It just sticks in the ground. It's like, thunk. Panda tries to wake up Dragon. And she's like, you just almost got speared by a tree. And he's like, oh, well, if it happens, it happens. Like, oh my God. So we stayed up until he just stayed asleep. But Panda and I just hung out for a little bit until the wind died down. But yeah, that was bad. The wind, I don't know if it was as strong as the wind in the Catskills, but it was the fact that those trees were just dropping branches. And we looked, they didn't look bad when we got there. But yeah, we heard a tree get blown down up on the mountain behind us. We heard another tree come down the next morning on the other side of the river. So it was kind of bad. There's a lot of stuff coming down there. So yeah, that was number 2. And then the worst wind was this past trip I did, and that was Easter Friday, just this year, 2024. And I looked at the weather, and it was supposed to be a little cloudy in the morning and then clear up. And winds, it was said like 12 miles to 19 miles an hour gusts, but it was supposed to get better. It wasn't supposed to get any worse. So I thought, well, all right. I mean, I know a bunch of spots. I'll just stay off the ridges and I'll stay down low and I should be okay. So as I was driving into the state forest, I decided to go the long way. And I usually take like the forest roads to get in there, but I took the main road, which goes in between the north and south tracks, called Bear Lake Road, because that takes you by all the main parking areas. And I figured, let me drive past all the main parking areas and see if it looks busy. And that'll help determine which way I go. And there weren't a lot of cars. There's a few cars out, but not a ton. And it was Friday, so I did notice, though, that it was really windy up there. So as I was going along that road, I decided I'm not going up to the North Loop because I thought about going up to that campsite that I bailed out in just to go up there and camp and actually make it through the night. And with that wind, I was like, if this wind doesn't get any better, I don't want that campsite just to be the one that I bail out in all the time. So I decided to go to the south side of the loop, which you can get down a little bit lower and out of the wind. So I didn't really have a plan. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I decided after I got hiking a little bit and saw it was kind of muddy. We've had a lot of rain. So I decided, you know what? I started out on the trail, but I decided I'm going to cut out to the main forest road, get out of the mud, and just hike back down. I know where the trail gets close to the road, where it used to do like a road section, and they've since rerouted it. But I know where the little spur that takes you back up to the trail, I know where that is. So I cut back up over there and went back to the first campsite in this little series of windy camps, which was Snow Squall. A lot of pines, coniferous, evergreens, very few hardwoods in there, and not many ash at all. Actually, in that little section, I don't think there's any ash. I think this may be a very old red pine plantation. It's no longer as organized as some pine plantations where you can clearly see the rows, but that was replanted. I said, I'll go in there. It is right on the edge of this fairly big swamp, so that's pretty open. But the last time it was really windy and I was here, I was pretty protected. That was not the case this time. And I didn't really record overnight at all in this video. And I could have, but it would just been dark with the sound of wind. It was all it would have been. I think the wind gusts got up to about 40 miles an hour. And it was bad. Even with all the protection of those red pines, the wind was still getting down into the forest. And the tarp just kept on, like even, it wasn't pulling out of the ground. The one stake kept coming, the stake wasn't coming out, but the cord kept on popping off the stake because it was taking the tension off because it was flapping so much. And I didn't really feel like looking for a rock or anything to put it on her. So at one point I just grabbed that cord and hooked it up to the ridgeline of the hammock just to keep that corner up. It did let a little bit of breeze in, but it was fine. It was just quieter. But that tarp just kept on slamming into the side of the hammock. Boom, 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 all night. And it was like hitting the hammock and pushing me over and rocking me. And the trees were swaying back and forth. So the hammock was getting raised up and dropped a couple inches at a time. It was, when I was a kid, I used to get motion sickness after a while. Thank God that doesn't happen anymore because I definitely would have been sick. I barely slept. My Garmin watch said that I got 6 hours of rest, but there was very little actual sleep. So I was able to nod off a couple times, but it was not fun. Now I could have, once I realized that wind wasn't getting any better, I could have broken down and left. If I was in a spot with more hardwoods, I probably would have. But knowing that those are all red pines and they're a little more resilient to wind, I felt safe. I've been in that campsite several times, and even though I've been in there several times, I still checked for dead standing and widowmakers up in the branches, but you don't get a lot of widowmakers with red pines unless it's a really, really old red pine. Their branches tend to stay small and stay high. So even if one breaks off, they're kind of fluffy, so they don't land as hard. but you can get some bigger branches off those trees. So you always have to watch for those. But that area, like I said, know the campsite pretty well. Did do another check and make sure everything was okay. But yeah, decided to ride it out because I really didn't want to drive home in the dark and wind, because the temperature did drop and that wind was cold. So it could have snowed. It could have been icy. So you got to weigh those options. Is it safer to stay or safer to go? Always check your weather. Make sure that the wind isn't too high. The more you camp and the more you hike and the more you're outside, you'll know what comfort level you have with wind. You'll know, and you'll look at it and be, oh, 25 mile an hour gust of wind? I'm not going out in that. Especially if you know the area and you know the trees and you know that it says 25, but at that spot, when it all funnels down through a mountain valley and it's more like 50, you know those things. But that all takes time. And also, if needed, don't be afraid to bail. There's nothing wrong with that. So I guess the key points to keep in mind are know the trees that are in the area that you're going to. If they are trees that are susceptible to any kind of illness in the area, like around us, we got the ash trees. Know how to identify an ash. Know how to identify a healthy tree. One of the best ways to do it is to find, if you've got an axe, don't chop into the tree, but use the butt end of the axe and hit the tree at the base. And we used to do this doing cables, called sounding the pole. And you can definitely tell a good pole from a bad pole. A good pole, when you hit it, it's a solid like thunk. And a bad pole, a rotted pole, it almost makes no sound whatsoever. It just sounds hollow. Trees, that's where they get poles from. It's from trees. They act the same way. So you can use a rock, or if you've got, like I said, an axe, don't use the blade of the axe. Use the butt of the axe, like the back of the head, like a hammer. And just hit the tree. Not real hard, just lightly to knock on it. But a rock works too. The barks, look for the leaves. Look for any kind of damage or anything like that. Look for dead, if it's got a lot of dead branches, then you know probably not to hang from it or near it. All right, so this is very interesting. I hope you guys are still listening as my phone goes crazy here as I'm getting notifications. I was recording. Let me put this in Do Not Disturb. While I was recording, I was just about wrapping up with the podcast, I heard some rattling in the house. Now, I've got headphones on. I got the microphone on. I just thought it was over-exaggerated because of that, and it was wind. I'm going to play that clip for you right now because I did catch it, and I'll let you know what it was from it or near it. Is that wind? So that sound you're hearing right there was not wind. That was an earthquake. We don't feel them here in Pennsylvania very often. From what I can tell, I looked it up real quick. There was a 4.8 magnitude earthquake in Lebanon, New Jersey. There's also one not too long before that in Indiana. So very weird. I know we just had a big earthquake in Taiwan. Wishing everyone in Taiwan well, because that was devastating what happened there. There's buildings that are half tipped over. I couldn't even imagine living through something like that. So wish everyone there very well. But yeah, we just felt one here. You never know what you're going to get with the weather in any area. So always be prepared. Now, with that, I'm going to say, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. You can always contact the show at hike.files@gmail.com. That's going to do it for me for this episode. See you in the next.